All right. This is Masters of Podcasting. I'm Conley.
I'm Melissa.
And today we are going to talk about episode 4, Thank You for Coming.
So at the very start of this episode, when did you connect the conversation that these two men were having with the fact that it was George talking about Ginny? Like, did you, when that happened and then it kind of skipped through a little bit and jumped forward, like, did you immediately connect the two things, or did you kind of wait it out to the end of the episode to get the narrative twist?
Well, I guess probably around the first time we saw George on screen, at the house. Surprise, I let the babysitter go home early and I have tried to make dinner. That was when I first thought, okay, how did he get in the study? What's going on? And so that was when I started to have questions about it. But I guess I didn't really connect him as talking about Ginny until towards the end.
See, and I wish that this was one instance where I wish that I hadn't read one of the critical reviews, because for some reason, like the really early reviews, because they released a bunch of these early for, pilot season and all that stuff, and one of the critics said, oh, this one has a really cool narrative device, and immediately I was like, oh, he's talking about Ginny there at the beginning. And like, I wish it would have been more ambiguous, or not the show, but the critics talk about that. But I thought that was a cool choice to do, to have her ex-husband suddenly show up, and we did sort of get a look at Ginny's past in a way.
Yeah, that was a really interesting reflection on her because, we see Ginny and she's so driven and she's so careful, even though she's, obviously willing to form whatever sort of romantic attachments, aromantic attachments, doesn't matter, but he's not, if you'd put him in a lineup, he's not the kind of person that you would have picked for her,
Right, and also we get an idea of what Ginny was like before she decided to grow up, I guess, and take on this job. Granted, it's through the lens of George trying to seduce her, but it still sounds like she used to be a bit of a free spirit.
Yeah, I could definitely see that in a way, just sort of, not that she, wasn't using her brain at the time or wasn't smart, but, I could see her just sort of going with the flow and letting the chips fall where they may and not really minding where they ended up and loving the adventure of it. George obviously still has this sort of freewheeling lifestyle where he gets to travel all over and meet all sorts of people. And, at one time, I'm sure that suited Virginia very well.
It's kind of funny to me looking back on this season and hearing him say that they got kicked out of a hotel in Miami because of all the noise Ginny was making.
Yeah.
I wonder if it was the same one as in episode 5.
Yeah, as long as they weren't singing any children's songs, I don't think there's any reason to be embarrassed.
And speaking of Pop Goes the Weasel pair, the trial montage, lots of people have talked about how great it is that there were lots of real-looking people in there, which was nice. You had very normal-looking human beings. They weren't all the good-looking, clean-cut kids like Jane and Austin were in the pilot. Lots of different body types, lots of different age ranges, and even someone, an older woman. And that was a key element of their study even before Bill kind of makes that connection in episode 5. So it's kind of nice to see in a retrospective of the season, seeing how all these things really fit together in a more carefully planned way than maybe we would have initially been led to believe on watching the first time.
Yeah, definitely.
So then we find out about Bill's sleepwalking, which is obviously induced by the twin elements of having this baby and his mother showing up. What did you think was going on the first time you saw this when all the music and the TV started up?
Well, at first I kind of wondered, well, is Bill just sort of, not that he's drunk, but you first wonder, all right, well, someone's just wandering around the house. Okay, why? And then really when it clicked for me was when you sort of see him standing in the kitchen just completely not reacting to any of the noise. That was when I realized it was sleepwalking, but until that point I just thought he was sort of pacing his house in some sort of mental frenzy,
One thing I noticed on rewatching this that's really stuck out to me, that was a nice piece of incredibly subtle acting. The shot doesn't call any attention to it. The actors don't really react in any specific way to it, but when Libby reaches over and takes his hand and puts his hand on her belly, to feel if maybe the baby is going to kick, his whole arm starts shaking. He wants nothing to do with this. It's so overwhelming and anxiety inducing, which I did not notice that until I watched it this time, and it was really interesting.
Honestly, I didn't even notice it in the rewatch. I was paying so much attention to Libby because you can see her not necessarily trying to pry the lid off of his secrets, but she's really just trying to nudge him. Like, it's okay to admit that you're nervous. Like, it's okay. And he's just, I mean, he completely shut down.
Yeah, and he even keeps turning away and pacing away further and further away from her. Walking further back into the darkness of the house, and he's just desperately trying to get away from this whole thing, starting with, turning on, and his story about his father finding him in the car, desperately trying to escape. We'll get into that later, but that was poignant in a really sad way.
I think we should talk about Essie. What did you think about the way that Bill perceived her and the way that she just suddenly appeared? Because, obviously these are two sort of diametrically opposed points of view, because Bill says, she can't make a decision, she's very timid, she's very wishy-washy, and then all of a sudden here's this cheerful lady in red at their door at, 10 in the morning. Hello!
Yeah, throughout this whole episode, I think they did a great job balancing. There was no one right point of view on the subject.
Right.
I mean, I sympathize with Bill, very much so, and I do think that Essie has her bad points. I think for her to just sweep into his life, everything's fine now, she's taken charge, and she's just going to act like that's, just wonderful, and that kind of sang-froid attitude about it. Meanwhile, he's had to live like this, and he's had to be formed with all of this. Like, that's the volcano in which he was created, essentially. Right. He was vulcanized. I think ultimately Bill is right to be so angry with her, in a way.
I mean, I definitely don't begrudge Bill for being angry, and I don't necessarily begrudge Essie for trying to move on, but that sort of veneer of trying to pretend that everything's fine, that's where, it really just pains me to watch the two of them together.
Yeah, and Libby's caught there in the middle in a lot of their conversations. Libby is just happy to have an older mother figure doting on her, because we find out later on, her mother has died a long time ago when she was a child, and so she's never had that happy, bubbly maternal figure around to, gossip with her and chatter away about the nursery choices.
And particularly with their relationship, I feel like that Essie is more honest with Libby than almost anyone else that we've seen. Not necessarily sugarcoating everything, not necessarily dishing every nasty detail, but, she definitely recognizes Libby's anxieties and sort of the changing, sort of acting as a mother figure and picking up on those things that Bill either doesn't want to see or won't see, and that no one else is really talking to her about.
It doesn't seem like Libby has too many friends. She wants to be social, and she gets some, much less fulfillment than she would really like out of being the party planner, but I think she would prefer to have to have someone around consistently to interact with.
I think this is a good segue to when Essie shows up at the hospital with Libby, and they meet Jenny, and soon the three of them are just gabbing together about, what Jenny should do about her ex-husband, and blah, 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 and they meet at the door of Bill's office, and Bill just sort of takes them in with this terrified expression like, oh, you've met. God, no.
Oh, shit, you're all here. All relevant women in my life.
This meeting of Masters women is now come to order.
Yes, yeah. And I noticed, first I want to talk about Mrs. Zelensky, because I think that's the best possible example, and I talked about this in a previous podcast. It's an example of Bill's better bedside manner, because the scene presumably starts just after he's asked her what she'll name the baby, and then, maybe he does this for all of his patients, but she's hugely pregnant, and so he sets her up. He reaches over and takes her hands and slowly gets her vertical.
Right.
Which was a nice touch, and, he tried to be as nice as he could, which isn't terribly nice. I mean, he can't help her, according to the rules of the hospital. Then, surrounded by all the women in his life clamoring for his attention in the doorway, he runs off after Mrs. Zelensky, as the more immediate situation, which was interesting. They're all there. He's rebuked Ginny for being late. Libby is there for her appointment. His mother wants a tour around the hospital, and he just turns and walks off to someone who needs more of his sympathy, empathy, I guess. I don't know, his help. So Bill's whole history cuts deep. And it's interesting that Zelensky tells him that as a woman, she has no choice, no agency in the matter. Because on a different show, that would make him magically realize how hard his mother's life must have been. But of course, he's still, by the end, he's still, it's his real life situation. So I think the one thing that comes out of it is that he managed to fix it for this woman who works in the laundry.
Well, and my takeaway was that the reason he became so invested in Mrs. Zelensky, not just because she was his patient and, she needed his help, but because it was really the one thing that he could control out of all of these situations that were really an echo of what happened to him and what he went through as a child. He saw this family and this woman who desperately needed not to have any more children, and this little boy who was already probably experiencing what Bill experienced as a child. I think he just saw a reflection of himself in that little boy, not necessarily a reflection of his mother in Mrs. Zelensky, but certainly, as an adult, as a doctor, he saw someone who he knew he could help and, wanted to break the rules in order to do that. With Essie at the hospital and observing Jenny and observing Bill and Libby, did you think initially that she suspected anything going on between them there?
No, I think she just saw Jenny as kind of this bright, competent secretary who was a work wife in the most platonic sense, managing his life and just being this cheerful influence on him. But it definitely, her visit to the hospital opens it for later episodes.
Well, subject change. Let's talk about Vivian.
Okay.
When she sits down at that lunch table, after you've gone through sort of the lunch line of Ethan's dating snafus.
I thought for sure she was going to cut him a new one because we'd never seen her before, and I thought, oh boy, here it comes. This is going to be, she's pregnant or something really awful happened. And then for her to be Scully's daughter, whom we had seen as a little girl in a previous episode, that was an interesting little twist.
What did you think when we kept seeing her throughout the episode? Like when she showed up at his apartment, I thought she was going to turn into Glenn Close and it was going to be like Fatal Attraction. I really...
Oh dear.
Over Ethan of all people.
I think I was mostly glad that Ethan's story was taking off in a different direction that didn't so directly involve Ginny. Even though he interacts with her quite a bit in this episode, it was like a reprieve from the constant obsession with her. It was like he had to spiral completely out of control and have sex with pretty much every woman in the hospital and go in and try to perform surgery drunk in order for him to catch himself up and finally realize that what he's doing is extremely destructive, not only for himself, but for a lot of people around him. And I think I kind of felt sorry for her at first because there's that scene later on after he's drunk and hungover the next day, and she says, no, it's okay, and he's willing to step up and say, no, it really is not okay.
When she shows up at the apartment and, she sees it just in complete disarray and sees his mental state and still, goes along with it and takes off her sweater and lets him lick alcohol from her boob,
Yeah.
It's one of those things where I'm just sitting there and going, no, my God, no. And then for her to turn around to say, essentially, look, I saw you at your very worst and, you should shape up. I'm still willing to be here, but you should shape up generally.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was nice. That was, while I still may not understand, why she's going after Ethan of all people, it at least, she does have a backbone. She can stand up for herself when necessary.
How did you feel about Vivian as a character? That we were introduced to her so quickly. Did you feel like the writers fleshed her out well enough to kind of become an entity of her own at this early stage? Well, I'm specifically referring to the little monologue she gives about her 16th birthday party and how awkward and embarrassing and how she kind of set herself up for disappointment and he managed to exceed her expectations.
I won't say that they fleshed her out as well as they could have, because, you know, it was half an episode, and it went from who the hell is this girl to, oh, okay, well, it's Vivian. I was intrigued with her, let's just say, because not just because of the choices that she was making, good or bad, but just generally, you know, I thought she had the potential to be an interesting character, if not just a love interest for Ethan, then, you know, somebody else at the hospital. So I don't know. I won't say that I was really gripped by her and really, you know, rooting for her, but as far as thinking she was interesting, yeah.
We should talk about the party that they throw.
What did you think of when they were setting up for the party, when Bill gets wind of Libby's setup and sort of, not necessarily goes off the deep end, but shows a lot more emotion than we have seen him show regarding a dinner party and regarding Ethan?
This is how shallow I am. I was distracted by his weekend wear and the fact that he wasn't wearing a bow tie. That's not to say that I wasn't paying attention, because that was really funny when he launched into that speech about, oh, she's too old for him, and she's already got children, all these reasons why they shouldn't be set up with each other, which could be equally applied to him and his own weird obsession with her. He's 9 years older than she is. She has the 2 children. You know, all these things go the other direction, too.
I don't know, it was just cracking me up because his very awkward excuses and, you know, really trying to engage on this point that normally he wouldn't have cared about at all, but it was cracking me up, just the way that Michael Sheen played that.
He has a lot of really funny lines in this episode. I think he has a very dry sense of humor, but I can't quite tell if Bill is fully aware that he's being funny. So the party itself is, God, that was a masterclass in awkwardness.
Between Essie's stories and the failed setup, and Jenny just trying to put as much distance between her and Ethan as possible. What did you think about Essie's story at that party?
What a shitty thing to do to someone. Like, she's fully aware of the fact that he's mad at her, he's had to experience all of this stuff, he's still smarting from all of it. And there she goes and tells what she thinks is a cute story and acts like she thinks he ought to be able to behave himself in public and just shrug it off like it's no big deal. Clearly, she has not spent a lot of time around him. Like, I got that feeling that Bill and Libby hadn't seen Essie since, like, their wedding or something.
I mean, I just got the sense that, not that they haven't spent time together, but that she really, honestly, is just going to bowl over whatever it is that he's thinking about his entire childhood, because it seemed to me in her quest to sort of move on and make everything quote-unquote normal, she just decided, well, I'm going to rewrite my whole history, and it's going to involve these cute stories that you can tell at parties that are actually terrible, and, you know, I'm going to start drinking cocktails and buying houses, and it was purposefully forced in a way that I don't know, I almost felt sorry for her, because just the level of denial that she was kind of dredging up with that story was so deep, you know?
And I really think it played more toward how neither Bill nor Essie are particularly, they're both sympathetic, and yet at the same time they're both not. They're fully realized complex human beings, and, you know, good on the writers for doing that, but no one is entirely in the right, but at the same time there are some aspects of it where neither of them is entirely in the wrong for the way that they're reacting now. Not entirely in the wrong.
I think especially when you see him walking down the hospital hallway right before he goes into surgery, and he's having these flashbacks to his own childhood, and you see the much younger Essie, you know, at the sink washing dishes, just turning up the radio and turning up the radio. You know, you really get a sense of them as people, because, you know, while Bill, in as much as he wants to avoid things and, you know, not talk about them and drown them out, he did get that from someone, and it was her. And, you know, they've sort of continued this pattern throughout the years, even now that Essie is actively trying to change it and to pretend that none of it ever happened to her.
And I think in a way, when they're talking about her buying a house, maybe he feels kind of betrayed by her sudden willingness to be spontaneous, because
yes,
he really has adapted, like you said, that level of necessary control, like obsessive degree of control over his life from her, and for her to suddenly decide that she's no longer going to do that, it kind of takes away part of his justification for doing it.
Yeah, I think it really throws him that she is so seemingly easily able to put it aside and just become this completely different person.
Because I think for her, it's just kind of the ghost of her husband, but for him, it's his entire way of life.
Right. I mean, those were his formative years. That, is what made him into the adult that he became. And so even if Essie is able to reconstruct herself and to come out of that fire with something resembling normalcy, he obviously just assimilated it into the puzzle that is Bill Masters.
Mm-hmm. When he was walking down the hallway and remembering his abuse, I'd never really listened to the background, like the voiceover of what was like happening in his flashback, because I was watching so carefully the mother. You get a lot of it's not meant to be necessarily directly canonical, I guess. It's just kind of, you're supposed to hear this background chaos, but when you listen to it, it's very revealing of like when child Bill says, help me, that was, I mean, of course, that would have been absolutely true. Essie, in real life, was completely unable to do anything for her children. She was so totally locked in this cycle as well that she was helpless just the same.
Yeah, I think that really is where a lot of the bitterness in their relationship comes from, because Bill, he still has that memory of, well, why didn't you help me? Why didn't you protect me? Particularly seeing this patient who, through her own very limited means, is trying to tell him as a doctor, this is the only thing I can do for my family. I can't, if I don't have this operation, I can't control how many children that I have. I can't control my circumstance, but, if I do this, I might have a chance. And I think Bill is still so angry that his mother either never had that chance or never took that chance, when now it seems that she had the fortitude to move on.
That's true. Yeah, he's seeing a completely different side of her.
That was what really struck me the most, was just sort of the difference between this mother, so vocally trying to protect her children the only way she can, and then Bill's mother, who turned up the radio when he was crying for help, and yet still is trying to be sort of your every woman mother to him during this time, and construct this image of the perfect family when they both know that wasn't what they had. I think that's what makes him the angriest about seeing her again this way, I would say.
Absolutely. And in that scene where he's talking to the father as well after the operation, the way Michael Sheen stages that, the blocking, Bill has his arms tucked in super tight against his sides, and it makes him look really strange in the suit that he's wearing. It makes it almost look like it's too big for him. Because he's got his arms, like he's holding a folder, but he's got his elbows locked against his sides, like he's trying to keep his arms from shaking.
Well, and you can really see, him understanding the little boy and doing whatever he can to sort of draw the fire away from the boy when he's in the room. But yeah, that I didn't notice the blocking, but I did notice that there was purpose to, obviously, watching the father with the baby and with the mother, and watching the way that he spoke to the little boy. Obviously Bill is a very observant person, and he took all of that in very carefully and very, as calmly as he could.
At the party, it just struck me as really great that we got a little bit of characterization for Tessa.
Yes.
Who is a total straight shooter. Like, who is he? Who are you? Do you give shots? I don't like him. I don't like you.
That cracked me up, because, I mean, I guess I imagined she would be a little like Jenny, but not to the point that we see, I don't know. I don't really know what I thought of her until this point, but I liked that.
I like her more and more. I like her.
And I thought it was funny, too, the kids, not just at the table, but when Henry accidentally clogs the master's toilet, they're in there and obviously have been trying to fix it on their own for several minutes, and all of a sudden Tessa runs out, Mister, there has been an error.
So we should talk about Ginny or George being in the study, I guess, the entirety of that. And that scene, I think this was really funny, and this is where I got Bill having a dry sense of humor, she comes in and she's ready to confess her sins to him, and she says, I've made this huge error, and he's busy thinking about this letter, and he says, well, just retype it.
It's fine, retype it.
And that was great. And she's all worked up about it because of what happened the last time the study was put in danger based on something that Bill was convinced that she did.
Right.
I think that's really where her anxiety comes from. And his other line, are you intentionally being cryptic? I love the whole thing. I love the whole thing. And his little, he's had all the control over the double blindness of the identity of the patients in the study.
Right.
And the way he plays that is also the beginning of Bill being the worst possible protagonist in the history of television. Because he just puts his glasses back on and says, no, I agree. I don't have to know. And she's just
I don't want to know.
I did. She was ready for she was ready for a big fight. She was ready to be fired all over again. She probably had all these defenses shored up and was, had some argument in her back pocket. And she's just totally abruptly, oh, okay, well, all right. I'll see you later.
Well, and that was what cracked me up because especially given, all the personal stress that he was going through, I fully anticipated him to just sort of shut Jenny out again. Not necessarily that she would be fired, but that, there would be some sort of retribution. But yeah, he puts his glasses on and says, nope, you're right. I don't need to know anymore.
Meanwhile, he's got a secret plan to figure out who this guy is.
That was what made me laugh the most, you talking about Bill's dry humor, because he goes from this, you're right, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Then all of a sudden you see his desk covered in files.
He's just launched into action. He's going to figure this out. He's going to solve this mystery.
Is it this nerd? No. Is it this guy? No. Was it the mouthy guy? Yes.
And his when he's going through the files initially, and George is talking right there, he says something like, oh, sometimes you just have to tell her, honey, let me lead. He's wearing the outfit that he was for his initial interview, so he was probably saying those things in front of Ginny.
Oh my God.
Which is a whole nother level of awesome. So,
Now, did you think that George took that as kind of like a sexual game? I don't necessarily think he was waiting for Ginny to break protocol and straddle him on the exam table, but he definitely, there was a glint in his eye.
I think he might be a bit of an exhibitionist in a way.
Yeah,
I think he was proud of having gotten to the point where they had to be kicked out of a hotel. That was a point of personal pride that he'd made that happen somehow, or that he'd been involved.
He's probably been telling that story for, the past however many years, 5-10 years.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he's the type who would trot that out over drinks. Yeah, this girl, I made her scream so loud, we got kicked out of a hotel. Bill really pushes those boundaries of being just a terribly unsympathetic protagonist, even after everything that he's gone through in this episode, his stress and the reveal that he'd been abused in the past. By doing all of this, by arranging all of this with George, and then crossing that line again by recording it and listening to it with Ginny standing in the next room, which was just
at that point I was honestly laughing because it was just, how could you possibly think this is a good idea? This is a terrible idea.
But I guess when you get in that situation where you're so immersed in your own obsession that you just, I don't know, you feel like you can get away with it and it must be fine.
I think everybody's been there too, to the point where they think, oh, I am so obsessed with, this person that surely this isn't harmful. I just want to know this one tiny thing and then I'll stop, and then it goes off the deep end. So
yeah. Were you, I know some of the original reviews and comments out there expressed that they were tired of all the talk and stuff being made of Ginny being this magical sex goddess. I think there was a lot of talk that they were kind of tired of that at this point in the series. And did you kind of feel that way, or did you feel like this episode finally started to turn that on its head? Because we got the whole speech about the Wizard of Oz stuff from Ethan, and in previous ones he's giving glowing reviews of her to anyone who'll listen. But were you tired of that, or did you feel like this was finally the point where we got a solid look at how Ginny's reality is compared to these men's fantasies about her?
I remember when we had talked about this, I think when the episode aired, and I brought up the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. I wasn't necessarily worried that Jenny would be played that way, because while all of these men are fascinated with her, for many of these different reasons, but not least because they find her very attractive, you really do get the sense that Jenny is just sort of hanging on and trying to do the best she can. And meanwhile, here are all these men just sort of constructing their own mind palaces as to how they imagine her and how they perceive her and how they would like her to be. I wasn't worried that it was going to turn into this, Jenny is magic, she's the perfect character kind of thing. It was, I don't know, I can't really explain it. I wasn't worried at this point, so.
Mm-hmm. I think the one thing that I felt about Jenny at this point in the series, I did start to kind of get, not tired of it exactly, but it started to become more obvious as a narrative point. Like, it was a
Right.
theme that they kept returning to. And I think at this point I was kind of worried that might become tiresome. But when you get glimpses of Jenny's reality, and this especially comes out in her big blow-up fight with George when he's waiting in her bed for her, those
Right.
moments help to shut down that kind of anxiety or concern, for me anyway.
And I think too, the fact that we're getting so many different perspectives at this episode, it's not just Ethan fixated on Jenny, it's not just Bill fixated on Jenny, but it's sort of everyone interacting with her in all these different ways. And to me, there was enough newness there, particularly with Bill and with George, and finding out, how Jenny was before she had kids, and like you said, before she decided to grow up. There was enough material that felt new to me and that felt like it had potential, that I didn't think, oh God, we're just going back to how amazing Jenny is,
What did you think about Bill at the end of this episode? What was your opinion of him?
Because he listened to the recording, or because he found out who George was?
Just kind of everything. Just sort of a combination of the absolute worst aspects of him, his obsessive, secretive nature, along with the sympatheticness of his past. He's so complicated and hard to pin down as either a protagonist or an antagonist here.
Well, and I really wasn't looking at him as, protagonist or antagonist per se. I just mainly was concerned about not necessarily his character, but there were just so many fascinating contradictions there, especially when you see those reflected in how his mother acts and how that dredges up a lot of painful childhood memories for him. But, on the one hand, we see someone who is so buttoned down, so controlled, so, I don't think repressed is the right word, but you know what I mean, so conservative in appearance and in action, almost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of paired with that enormous ego and this need to be recognized and this compulsivity, whether it's about the work or whether it's about Jenny or all of these different things. I thought it was really, he's a fascinating character, all the more so because it's based, on someone's true life and on a real person.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, it wasn't, oh my God, he spied on Jenny, how dare he? It was just sort of, how can this be the same person?
I remember seeing when you watch the show live, you get next time on clips and teaser trailers for the future. And I think it was maybe an episode ago when I saw one of those that they'd constructed with random clips. And one of them was Jenny looking at Bill from across the car.
Oh.
And I remember thinking that was going to be much later in the series, and it shocked me that it was here. But I liked that scene because it had Bill paying Jenny a compliment in the most backwards, convoluted, veiled manner possible.
If I give you this compliment and you don't know it, it's not really a compliment.
But he just assumes right off the bat that she must be a good mother. And the way she looks over at him is just, it's fascinating. It's intriguing because you don't know what she's thinking so much of the time.
Well, I think that's the first time, too, that anyone has looked at Jenny and after seeing the chaos and the strange nature of her life, being a divorced mother in 1956, and said, you're so good at it. How are you so good at it? And Jenny kind of looks at him like, I'm sorry, are you talking to the right person?
even and he says it like it's not really a reflection on whether or not her children are good, but he says that even after the chaos of her kids, creating this mess at his house and during the party, like he still musters up this nice thing to say to her. It's kind of weird.
Well, and it felt very poignant to me because, like you said, her kids essentially just blew up his bathroom. And here he is asking her what it is to be a good mother, and did she think she was born with that skill? And you can really, in as much as this episode shows him as being terrified of fatherhood and of having a child and how to interact with a child, you can see that tiny glimmer that, he buries very deep down that says, well, is it something I could be good at, even given everything else that has been shit in my family life?
I want to talk about, as a last point, let's talk about Libby asking Essie about Bill's father. Do you think Libby suspects what's going on?
I think Libby has more suspicions than she lets on. Because obviously, she has seen Bill, a man who betrays very little emotion generally, wandering around her house at 3 a.m, turning on every single appliance and just sleepwalking all the time and really not knowing how to express anything about fatherhood. She's seen that. She's seen he and his mother argue, and she's seen the way that Essie conducts herself. And so I think she is too polite to ask, okay, well, what the hell happened? But she probably does suspect something wrong there.
I think I can see where Libby suspects that something is wrong, but I don't think she has the worldview or the experience with a crueler. Well, okay, that's not to discount her awful beginnings in life as well, but I don't think she has enough experience with how cruel the world can be to suspect just how extreme Bill's childhood really was.
No, I wouldn't say, she's jumped right to, well, he must have been a tyrant and, the worst man possible. But I think she does at least recognize that, his father was, as Essie says, doesn't mean he's a good man. He wasn't a good man. But I don't think she's jumped straight to, oh, he was abusive. Oh, he was, whatever we would call it today.
And as far as Essie having that line about women being the ones who look at the past and men only ever looking toward the future, in a way, I think it's too black and white and reductive. I think she's got it reversed.
Really?
The reality is very different from what she's saying there, because she, as a woman, is looking solely towards the future. She's drinking cocktails and buying houses and moving and traveling on her own and all this stuff, and looking for an escape with this new life. And meanwhile, Bill is trapped in obsessing over the past because, like we've said, that's his baseline. That's all he's got.
Mm-hmm.
Which is an awfully, and Essie is a little condescending by turning to Libby and saying, well, you just don't know men, dear.
That cracked me up, honestly.
Because
it as condescending as it was, it was a nice little reveal into Essie, into the things that she doesn't say, but, has experienced and has lived through. And here's Libby, who, while she has also lived through some awful things, she has a very cheerful view of the world and a very optimistic view of people. And so for Essie to come right in and undercut her, it was amusing in a very dark way to me.
Anything else that we want to talk about finally?
One
thing that stood out at me in this episode was that really funny cut after George seduces Ginny. She says, well, you're not gonna spend the night, and then he's giving her oral sex. He has his hand on one of her breasts, and that's I think this is a connection to the end of episode 6. I think we have a backwards confirmation.
Yeah, I could definitely see that.
I think that's the case. So anyway, okay.
I can't think of anything else.
All right, well, we will be back next time to talk about episode 5.
All right, we will see you then.
Bye-bye.